Okay, hello everyone. This is Colin Cox, and this is week 3 for English 1020. I don't want to waste any time. I want to jump right in. But first, what I wanted to say is today, with the poetry that I asked you to read, I want to spend a fair amount of time talking about certainly tone and theme, but I also want to think about how the use of symbols and symbolism, and in particular, location, helps to inform the development, in particular, of certain themes. And I won't have time to talk about all of the poetry that I asked you to read. In fact, I might produce a second supplemental piece of audio where I talk about the Sir Walter Raleigh and the Christopher Marlowe poems, because they are interesting and important, but I may not have time to talk about them today. So I think I actually want to start with the Adrienne Rich poem, Aunt Jennifer's Tigers. So because it's a short poem, I can read it to you, but I would encourage you to follow along. In the book, I believe it begins around 843. So, okay. Aunt Jennifer's tigers prance across a screen, bright topaz denizens of a world of green. They do not fear the men beneath the tree. They pace in sleek, chivalric certainty. Aunt Jennifer's fingers flutter through her wool, find even the ivory needle hard to pull. The massive weight of Uncle's wedding band sits heavily upon Aunt Jennifer's hand. When Aunt is dead, her terrified hands will lie, still ringed with ordeals she was mastered by. The tigers in the panel that she made will go on prancing, proud and unafraid. So within each stanza, if we wanted to just say something quickly about structure, you'll notice a distinct rhyming pattern. It's A, B, B. So for example, screen and green rhyme, as do tree and certainty. And then in stanza 2, wool pull, band hand. In the third and final stanza, lie by, made unafraid. So that gives this poem an interesting and predictable rhythm to it. But I think starting with the situation, starting with location, might be an interesting place to actually start. So even though we're not given necessarily a distinct time, so there isn't necessarily a temporal setting, we do know the poem was published in 1951. We are perhaps meant to think, because there isn't this distinct temporal setting, perhaps what Rich wants to do here is develop a theme or an idea that is meant to feel universal. This is not something that any one person experienced at a particular moment in time. And if we wanted to continue thinking about location, it's also, Rich doesn't give us a particular geographic location. There isn't really any language to describe an actual setting itself. Now, with that said, I think there is this sense, or there is this implication, that we're in a domestic space. If, for example, you look at stanza 2, we know that Aunt Jennifer, she's doing this embroidery work with this wool and this ivory needle, which, because of knitting and embroidery, the way we have conventionally gendered that as an activity for women, I think you could argue, or you could infer, that we are in a domestic space. And I think that's interesting as well, because part of what Rich tries to do in this poem is think through some of the, and dramatize some of the bad feelings that women have in marriages where power isn't equally distributed, where, again, this is something, if you know anything about Adrienne Rich, she was quite critical of the patriarchal system that really defined the world as she knew it and the world that she lived, and the forms of oppression that women feel in some marriages. And we We have a sense of this, I think, in a couple of different ways. I think one of the more overt ways that we have a sense of these feelings of oppression and perhaps even fear and trepidation, it's right there in stanza 2. We learn, quote, that the massive weight of Uncle's wedding band sits heavily upon Aunt Jennifer's hand. And I would encourage you here, because now we're thinking more about symbols than anything else and symbolism, thinking about what the wedding ring or the wedding band often symbolizes, and thinking about how Rich does an interesting job of actually inverting it a bit. We often think of the wedding band as a symbol of unity between two people who marry one another, but here Rich does something different with it. The wedding band becomes something of a burden, something that she must carry, something that, according to the speaker in this poem, quite literally pulls Rich down. It has this oppressive quality to it. And I would argue, at least, it's important to clarify that it's not just a ring, but it's the wedding band that her husband gave her, obviously, on, in theory, the day of their wedding. So this is one of the more overt moments that Rich communicates this idea about this person, Aunt Jennifer, and the sense of oppression, fear, and trepidation that she feels about being in this marriage and potentially feeling trapped in this marriage. Because if we wanted to now transition and say something about the tigers themselves and what they represent, I think those ideas, this sense of oppression, this lack of freedom that Aunt Jennifer feels, it's connected to what we see with these tigers. So in line 1, for example, and I think this is an interesting place to start and an interesting way to start, we learn that these tigers prance across the screen. And prance is one of those words. This is when I talk a lot about doing deep, thorough sentence level analysis. This is one of those opportunities, focusing on a word like prance, where you can talk about the tigers as symbolically important, but you can also talk about word choice and diction as important as well, because one of the things I like to do is to often think of synonyms for words. So what's a synonym for a word like prance? Well, it might be to walk or to move, but I think the implication of a word like prance, it's obviously different from a word like walk, because when you prance, you have a kind of confidence about you. Maybe someone might say you're peacocking a bit when you prance. And I think imagining this as a reflection of certain ideas and perhaps even certain ideals that these tigers embody, it's in stark contrast to perhaps how Aunt Jennifer actually feels, where she seems quite timid. She seems powerless. But by contrast, we have these tigers that from the very beginning are meant to feel extremely powerful. And she extends this idea with the final 2 lines of stanza 1. Notice, for example, quote, "These tigers, they do not fear the men beneath the tree." And I think it's important that they are men because of how, again, this is a kind of projection of Aunt Jennifer. They pace in sleek, chivalric certainty. So I think what Rich is trying to suggest or dramatize here is how tigers, they're certainly predatory figures, but unfortunately they're also prey at times to big game hunters. But notice, even as we acknowledge that reality, these tigers, it's as if the world that Aunt Jennifer has constructed is one where even though they are potentially prey to big game hunters, they don't seem affected by it, or there seems to be this lack with these men who are potentially, in theory, hunting them, because they're just unable to really affect the tiger at all. Again, affect these tigers at all. Notice these tigers, they don't fear them, and they pace in, quote, sleek, chivalric certainty. There's a kind of confidence with these tigers. They're not affected by this potential threat of these big game hunters. And imagining this as a kind of fantasy projection for Aunt Jennifer, thinking of the tigers, again, symbolically as a representation of what Jennifer wants, and perhaps there's a sense of tragedy here because in her actual lived life, she, at least the poem wants us to think, never had the opportunity to fully realize the confidence and the certainty that her tigers do. So you can almost think of the tigers as a kind of projection of her fantasies, her desires, etc. And the final stanza is interesting because I think what it does is suggest that even though Aunt Jennifer's life was one, and again, we're making inferences here, one potentially defined by fear and oppression, a lack of power and a lack of agency, despite all of that, she did have this way of channeling all of those feelings, and it was these tigers that she made. And I'll talk a little bit about the power of art because I think that's part of what's happening here too, but I'll just reread that final stanza one additional time. Okay, when Aunt Jennifer is dead, her terrified hands will lie still ringed with ordeals she was mastered by. The tigers in the panel that she made will go on prancing, proud and unafraid. So notice an interesting bit of repetition in line 2 of this stanza, which is actually line 10, still ringed, so making yet another reference to rings and how, at least within the confines of this poem, they are symbols of oppression, not unity. But notice, despite the fact that Aunt Jennifer died, and even though, again, she didn't have this opportunity to experience the kind of liberation that she should, that maybe a lot of us would want for her, her tigers did and do. And I think what's important is they continue to. So what we're seeing here is even though Aunt Jennifer's life ended, the art she produced as a kind of projection of her fantasy, it doesn't die. It didn't die. There's a longevity to Aunt Jennifer that exceeds the limit of her body, her life, etc. And it's all filtered and channeled through the art she produces. And a lot of poetry in this way, it's perhaps meta poetry. It's art about the power of art, or art about art. But the final thing perhaps worth thinking about is, who is our speaker here? And obviously calling her Aunt Jennifer and also making reference to uncle in stanza 2 gives us this sense that whomever this speaker is, they were obviously a family member, which is interesting because if they are in fact a family member, that would potentially imply that what Jennifer experienced wasn't something she necessarily experienced alone or in isolation, or perhaps a better way to think about it is it's something that was known, but there's nothing perhaps this family could do to stop it, whatever it was. So in that way, our speaker, they're not some objective figure. They are deeply subjective. They seem to have perhaps a stake in this. There's a kind of proximity and intimacy, and I'll leave it to you to decide if we should make any more of that or what we can and should make of it. But what I'll say finally, just in summation, is thinking about these tigers as interesting symbolic figures, I would argue, gets you to some of the larger themes of the poem. freedom, oppression, power, and maybe weakness is a wrong word, but perhaps a lack of power or a dearth of power. But also, this is a poem that's interested in thinking through dynamics in relationship and marriage dynamics in a patriarchal system. And that's something, again, if you know anything about Adrienne Rich, this is something that she was deeply interested in thinking through and dramatizing in her poetry. This poem is not unique in that sense. So, okay, from here, I think I want to transition to Alzheimer's by Kelly Cherry, and this poem begins on 1133. So, once again, follow along with me. He stands at the door, a crazy old man, back from the hospital, his mind rattling like the suitcase swinging from his hand that contains shaving cream, a piggy bank, a book he sometimes pretends to read, his clothes. On the brick wall beside him, roses and columbine slug it out for space, claw the mortar. The sun is shining as it does late in the afternoon in England after rain. Sun hardens the house, reifies it, strikes the iron grill work like a smithy, and sparks fly off, burning in the bushes, the rose bushes, while the white wood trim defines solidity and space. This is his house. He remembers it as his, remembers the walkway he built between the front room and the garage, the rhododendron he planted in back, the car he used to drive. He remembers himself, a young man in a tweed hat, a man who loved music. There is no time for that now. No time for music, the peculiar screeching of strings, the luxurious fiddling with emotion. Other things have become more urgent. Other matters are now of great import, have more consequence, must be attended to. The first thing he must do now that he is home is decide who this woman is. This old, white-haired woman standing here in the doorway, welcoming him in. So one of the things that I always like to ask my students, because I think far too many of us are familiar with these sorts of degenerative diseases like Alzheimer's or dementia, the question I always like to start with is, to what degree does Cherry accurately represent what Alzheimer's looks like? And we can think of it in two ways, not just how the disease affects those afflicted with the disease, but, and now we're thinking a bit about the speaker, how it also affects those in caretaker positions, people who, whether they are spouses, children, hired workers, etc., how this disease affects them too, because I think this poem effectively addresses or attempts to address both parties, both again those afflicted by these sorts of diseases, but those who are in a position to care for the afflicted. Now, the home itself, the home this old man owns, I think is an interesting symbol, or it works symbolically in interesting ways in this poem. And one of the first things to perhaps notice or speak about are all of these different plants and flowers around the house. I think one of the more striking lines is line 7, or it actually begins on line 6. We get something called an enjambment here, where the previous line or sentence, because again this is something of a different poem, or it's more free verse, the way the sentence from the previous lines end in the middle of line 6. But this is how that next sentence, or how that next full statement begins. It begins in line 6. On the brick wall beside him, roses and columbine slug it out for space, claw the mortar. So I think what we're seeing here is this interesting way of perhaps dramatizing, as I understand it, this fight that Alzheimer's and dementia patients have or experience this fight with knowledge, with certainty, with any sense that the world around them is something they know, something they can remember, and something they're even cognizant of. There's this constant fight, this constant warring between the disease and your mind's desire and ability to maintain any form of stability. And we also have these interesting moments, these interesting little descriptions of the house. Notice line 15. This is his house. He remembers it as his, remembers the walkway he built between the front room and the garage, the rhododendron he planted in back, the car he used to drive. So again, all of this he remembers, but they're just bits and pieces that he remembers. It's not perhaps a full picture. It's not robust. It's not comprehensive. It's just little fragments. And the speaker, Cherry Speaker, really crystallizes this for us at the end, where he's able to perhaps recognize and acknowledge some of the elements of this house, but perhaps the most important thing, the person, whomever she is, standing in the door, he has no recollection of her whatsoever. And I think, again, this is a really nice and effective way of communicating the tragedy of these sorts of degenerative diseases, how they permit people who suffer from them to remember remarkably detailed bits of information about certain things, but not others. Perhaps in particular, the important and significant people in their lives. And this is perhaps an opportunity to say a little more and think a little more about this speaker. So who exactly do you think this is? I think a conventional reading, and I'm not opposed to conventional readings. I think a conventional reading is, well, this is his wife, this is his spouse. And I think there's a couple of reasons why we might think this. The first, again, if you think about how this poem bookends itself, it begins with this old man and it ends with a reference to this old white-haired woman. And I think, again, that kind of symmetry would perhaps suggest that they're spouses. I think you could argue that all of the detailed information that this speaker has might suggest that they've lived a life together. Notice she seems to remember him when he was remember him when he was a much younger person. He remembers himself a younger man in a tweed hat, a man who loved music. There is no time for that now, but potentially something else that's happening here. And I think this is in some ways similar to what we saw in the last poem with Adrienne Rich, where Aunt Jennifer's tigers were and are this projection of a kind of fantasy. Because unless you want to assume the speaker in this poem is omniscient, which is to say they know everything, which how could they? But again, it's art. So what is true for us is not necessarily what's always true for, speakers in poems, characters in novels, etc. But if we want to imagine that this speaker isn't omniscient, well, perhaps what we're seeing here is a kind of fantasy, a hope even, that what he's doing is actually remembering, when in fact perhaps he isn't. Perhaps he's incapable of doing that. And I think you could certainly understand why that's a hope this speaker has, why this is perhaps a fantasy she has, that when she looks at him, what she sees, what he's actually doing, is something that, because of his disease, regrettably, he's incapable of doing, or progressively becoming incapable of doing, which is recalling memories, recalling the past, etc. And again, I think it's obvious why, or we understand why this speaker would want to do that, because if you know someone, if you currently know someone who, or if you've witnessed the rather aggressive effects of these sorts of diseases, you perhaps understand this feeling. You want because they look, often they look, externally at least, completely fine, but the contradiction there, I suppose, is their external appearance has the effect of masking this disease that's inside of them. And again, I think we can all understand why Cherry Speaker would want to fantasize about this old man actively remembering things. And again, I think there are these other subtle moments where Cherry is extremely smart about what it just means. The again, some of the contradictions perhaps in appearance of suffering from these sorts of diseases. If we go back to the beginning, for example, we see this interesting simile where she compares his suitcase to how his mind and how his brain feels. His mind rattling like the suitcase swinging from his hand that contains shaving cream, a piggy bank, a book he sometimes pretends to read, his clothes. So I think the content of this suitcase is extremely interesting. Notice, for example, he has shaving cream in this suitcase, a symbol of perhaps maturity, but he also has a piggy bank, a symbol of immaturity. And I'll talk about the book in just a second, but with these first two items, he's both old and young, mature and immature, which, again, thinking about the effects of diseases like Alzheimer's, it often renders those who have these diseases to seem both young and old at the same time. Again, it's in many ways a disease defined by contradictions, right? He's this person, this old man, he's quite literally losing, regrettably, his mind, and that has the effect of rendering him helpless in the same ways that small children are relatively helpless. But all of that's encased within this body that's much older and more mature. So again, Cherry is quite good about thinking of Alzheimer's as a disease defined by contradictions. And then I think one of the more sympathetic moments is he carries a book that he pretends to read. And again, this is where I think Cherry, she's so good with tone, because there are some times when I don't think flippant is the correct word, but there's a kind of playfulness to her language, like referring to him as a crazy old man, referring to the speaker as an old white-haired woman. But there are also these moments that are unmistakably and deeply just sympathetic, and just reveal the depth of sympathy that Cherry has for people who suffer from these diseases, because he's cognizant enough of this disease, and he's cognizant enough of the effects that it has, yet he's still desperately trying to mask it. And can you think of anything more innately human than what this old man tries to do with not just the content of the suitcase, but specifically, particularly the book, and in theory his insistence on always having the book with him, always having this form of distraction, not for him, but potentially for anyone seeing him, maybe trying to convince people that he isn't as sick as he perhaps is. Again, I can't think of anything more human than that impulse, that drive, and Cherry so beautifully describes it and dramatizes it here. So I don't know if there's anything else I want to say about this poem. Again, if we're thinking about some of the larger themes, it's obviously interested in just showing us through art, through poetry, something that feels quite often to us rather clinical, the sort of thing that we don't often imagine art having perhaps any interest, I suppose, in dramatizing. Art and poetry, again, thinking of poetry as just an extension of art, it often grapples with some of those bigger, more universal feelings like love, anger, so on and so forth. But I think what we see with Cherry is this earnest attempt to show the effects of something and not just develop and dramatize an idea or a particular theme. So I think from here, I want to transition to the Philip Larkin poem, This Be the Verse, which begins on 849. Okay, again, follow along with me. They fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throat. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can, and don't have any kids yourself. So I think obviously what's interesting about this poem is how Larkin uses incendiary language at times. The opening line, they fuck you up, your mom and dad. I think what's really clever about this is how almost immediately, I would argue at least, because it lacks any real specificity, right? Well, how do they do this? I think as readers, we almost immediately start to fill in this ambiguity with the specifics or the particulars of how our parents may have fucked us up a bit. Some, perhaps, obviously more than others. But from here, Larkin, he at least attempts to offer a bit of detail and a bit of texture to what this ultimately means, or what he's thinking about when he writes, they fuck you up, your mom and dad. He says, they fill you with the faults they had and add some extra just for you. But even there's a fair amount of ambiguity. And I think what Larkin is quite good at doing is perhaps prompting you, whether you knew it or not, as a reader to fill in this gap in knowledge or information, to really treat or to allow or even create a permission structure for you as the reader to see this opening stanza as something of a Rorschach test, or maybe you've seen these before, these inkblot tests, which when you look at them, you see whatever you want to see. And the idea or the goal is that it reveals something innate in your unconscious. And I think this opening stanza has a similar sort of effect. And it also, at least as an opening stanza, really casts parents in the worst kind of way possible, or in the worst kind of light imaginable. You can almost imagine that Larkin, he's writing this not as a parent, but as a child. But then something quite interesting happens in the second stanza in line 5, because I think Larkin, he offers what I would argue is perhaps a concession, or he's offering some sympathy to parents. He writes, "But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats who half the time were soppy stern and half at one another's throats." So here it seems like what Larkin wants to say or suggest is these feelings you have, this sense that all of us as children have, that our parents, while they might have been quite good to us at times, they also did something to us that is fundamentally impossible to repair. And while that is certainly true, perhaps what we should acknowledge is, well, their parents did it to them too, and it's this interesting moment where Larkin, he's articulating this lineage of trauma that's just passed from generation to generation. And I think what it does, it has the effect of contextualizing our feelings toward our parents in a much larger conversation, and it has the effect of actually universalizing this idea, as if to suggest what your parents, just broadly speaking, because again, what's interesting is Larkin, he doesn't offer a lot of specifics, he's just speaking in broad generalities. What your parents, broadly speaking, did to you, well, their parents did to them, and their parents did to them, and their parents did to them, and so on and so forth. And this reference in the final 2 lines of the stanza about half the time they were soppy stern and the other half at one another's throat, I think what it's ultimately attempting to suggest is that there just wasn't a lot of consistency there. While many of us may or may not, in fact, have particular thoughts or ideas about what good parenting looks like, I think perhaps all of us might agree that good parenting, like a lot of things, probably requires a fair amount of consistency, and it's not conducive to a healthy relationship with anyone if there's just a lot of inconsistency and perhaps maybe even more particular, or perhaps in particular if there's just a lot of antagonism, a lot of frustration, anger, resentment, etc. So what Larkin does here in the opening stanza, he offers something of a statement, an argument, right? He's attempting to make a point. He then challenges that point in line 2 by offering a broader context, contextualizing the point he makes in stanza 1 with this broader set of ideas, or this larger context, and then he almost transitions to a solution of some kind. So we have the introduction of a problem, the perhaps the deepening of that problem by introducing perhaps an additional contradiction or some contradictory ideas, and now he's attempting to arrive at something that looks like a solution, and his solution is quite interesting. It's not, we need to fundamentally change the way we parent children. It's far more nihilistic and perhaps even misanthropic. He says, in effect, just don't have kids. We just need to stop, all of this. And as I'm saying it, perhaps you can detect a bit of humor in how I'm saying it, because I would just ask you, how do you read this? Do you think he's being earnest? Is he speaking in earnest when he says this? Or is this a satirical moment? And even if it is a satirical moment, perhaps what he's getting at, or the idea he's able to extract from this thought experiment is perhaps humanity just can't work, or perhaps there's something so deeply and fundamentally flawed about us that unfortunately there's no way to arrive at a satisfactory answer to the question, the implicit question that he explores, other than we need to just shut it down. So I'll leave it to you to decide what you ultimately think of that. But I do think one of the things I like about this poem, and it's similar in this way perhaps to Billy Collins and a lot of his work, is how Larkin addresses this question with a bit of humor, and there's a bit of levity here. Even look at the title, for example, "This Be the Verse," right? There's something, it feels elevated in some way. You could imagine, for example, someone like William Shakespeare writing "This Be the Verse," and I think there's obviously a bit of satirical humor there, especially if you read the first line of the poem, which at least stylistically offers an interesting, perhaps, contrast. But I think also just the idea of "this be the verse," it's like he has an epiphany, you know? It's like, this is it. I got it. I figured out the problem with parenting. We just need to stop having kids. So I think, considering how the final stanza offers perhaps an interesting, or a surprise maybe is the best way to describe it, to the promise of the title, it seems to imply that perhaps there's something satirical happening here. There's a degree of humor and levity to this poem that maybe we wouldn't anticipate, especially when we think about, if you don't mind, a word like fuck, which has a lot of aggression to it. Even just the way the word sounds when you say it, there's a lot of hard consonant sounds. It's monosyllabic, which is to say it's a one syllable word. I think often, even when we use and deploy this word, not always of course, but it's often used with a sort of aggression behind it, and all of that offers, again, just some interesting contrasts when you think about what this poem, what it's ultimately about, the tone when you take the poem in its totality, the sorts of conclusions that Larkin arrives at. It's just a delightfully, perhaps, contradictory poem in that way. And the final thing I'll say, because it is a poem about parents and parenting, it would pair quite nicely with a poem like "To a Daughter Leaving Home" by Linda Paston, or perhaps even to a poem like "Divorce" by Billy Collins, which that's perhaps less about children, but it's certainly about adults in relationships where this is not always true, but often the assumption is, people have children. So anyway, all of those, again, maybe "Divorce" less so, but certainly "This Be the Verse" and "To a Daughter Leaving Home," I think you could write an interesting essay about parents and parenting, because both certainly grapple with those ideas. Okay, I think that's all I want to say for this week's lecture. Later this week, I mentioned this at the beginning, I may release a supplemental bit of audio about the Marlowe and the Raleigh poems. And my apologies if you could hear this fan coming on and off occasionally throughout the audio. That's something I can't control because I'm recording at home, so I apologize if that was a bit disruptive. But if you have any questions, don't hesitate to email me. And again, this is Colin Cox for English 1020.